Hi, everyone, and welcome back to the afternoon session of Sheet. All the presentations we have this afternoon. I've still got my spreadsheet t-shirt on, and you can still win one of those in the swag bag competition. That link is on the reception page. A few more winners just to announce here. So congratulations to Maria C. from Virginia, Julian G. from Colombia, Arvin I. from Florida, and Annie S. from Indiana. So you'll have a t-shirt and some SheetsCon stickers on the way to you soon. So like I said, still time to enter. That link is on the reception page. Now then, on to our next presentation. I'm delighted to have David Crevitt with me on the stage here. He's a digital marketing and analytics expert and a Google Sheets expert as well. And he's been doing some really, really interesting and innovative work with Google Sheets and BigQuery and data pipelines for the past couple of years. So I'm really excited to hear what David's got in store for us. And he's going to be talking about when your data gets a little too large for Google Sheets, how to sort of move up from the Google Sheets world to the Google Sheets plus BigQuery plus Data Studio pipeline type world, the more robust analytics type pipeline. So it's going to be some good stuff. So get your questions ready for David, ask them in the sidebar. I'll be gathering them all up to ask David at the end of his presentation. So I'm going to drop out the feed now and leave David do it. See you all a bit later on.
Thanks, Ben, for that introduction. We live here, Mariah? Great. Thanks, Ben, so much for having me. As he said, I'm David Crevitt. I'm the creator of a blog called Coding is for Losers that started back in 2015, and since then has evolved, into something much different than, your classic blog, but we'll get into all of that. And first of all, thanks, Ben, for having the foresight to organize a virtual conference so that we could actually do this week. Very prescient of you, I'll say. And what I wanted to start off with is, as Ben mentioned, I'm going to talk about how you can kind of move from Sheets to BigQuery when your data gets a little bit too large to handle in Sheets. But I really wanted to start off talking about just a painting that I saw a couple weeks ago, and it really resonated with me, and I think kind of explains a lot about this challenge of data size in Sheets and moving to BigQuery. And this painting, it's right behind me here on the screen, it's by a woman named Lee Lozano. She painted it in 1964, and it's called Ream. She did this whole series of kind of tools and common workshop objects. And a ream, as you can see, is, it's basically like a screw type of device. And it hit me really hard. This is a photo of that was surreptitiously taken of me actually looking at this painting for the first time a couple weeks ago here in Austin. And it hit me really hard because first of all, I didn't know what I was going to talk about today, right? I knew I wanted to talk about BigQuery in general, but I didn't, know the message yet. And it hit me because I realized that everything that grows large, right, to the broad end of this starts with just, a simple, small thing. And that's really what Sheets and BigQuery are to me and have been in my work. Everything that I've ever done in business has started with a Google Sheet, and eventually it grows up to BigQuery. And how that kind of process happens, you don't really realize it at the time, right? I only realized it in hindsight preparing for this talk, how it happened. It's not an active step that you take. It's just a learning path that you're on. And I think for a lot of us watching this, right, who work in this kind of Google Sheets ecosystem, that's how things go. You learn things organically as you need to, and you grow over time. And before you know it, you're doing things that you never imagined when you set out, right? No one sets out and says, oh, I want to build this BigQuery data pipeline. That's exactly what I want to do today when I put my pants on. It's just something that you grow into, and that happens. So where my team at Coding is for Losers is at today is we primarily work in BigQuery, right? We build data pipelines for digital agencies in BigQuery. We also publish what we call BigQuery recipes. We like to name things. And those are kind of pre-canned data analysis processes that we run for clients in BigQuery, like a website audit and ad funnel breakdown, stuff like that. So today we're working mostly in BigQuery, but everything that we do, everything that we ever build still starts as a Google Sheets template, a Google Sheets prototype. And we still take this growth path from Sheets to BigQuery, even though, we have developers on our team and a lot of competence for writing code. We still start everything in a sheet to validate that it works, that people want it, and it's actually what we want to be building, right? So the main thing I want you to take away, if you take away anything from this talk, is that lurking in your Google Drives today are, I'm sure, tons of ideas for processes that you could scale up from Sheets to BigQuery, for products that you could publish, right, in Sheets or in BigQuery, things that you could continue growing in this stack. And they're already there. You just maybe haven't looked at them in that way yet. So there's three things I want to talk about. One is our own journey, right? What I'm about, what Coding is for Losers has done, and how we've moved from Sheets to BigQuery over the last few years. Two is a few examples of products and projects that have taken this path. Like I said, we always start in a sheet, move to BigQuery. So we'll actually walk through how that happened for a couple different projects. And the third thing I want to talk about is how you can do the same thing in your own work, kind of what skills are required, why you should learn them, or why you should not learn them. So before we dive into those, I would love to share just some background on my own story for those of you who don't know me. So this is me back in 2008. I was a sophomore in college. I think that photo might be from later, but at any rate, I had a lot less hair. And I was starting my first internship in college, and it was going to involve a lot of spreadsheet work. And I honestly had never really worked in spreadsheets. I was a complete and utter noob, I would say. And so I really credit my boss, Dan, there with helping me along that path. He assigned me a bunch of stuff to do in Sheets, and I went back to my desk, and I kind of sat there and kind of staring at the screen like, oh, okay, I don't know how to do this. I have no idea how to do this. So I go back to Dan's desk, and I'm like, all right, Dan, how do I do this? And he goes, oh, you don't know how to use VLOOKUP? I'm like, no, of course not. I don't know anything. So he taught me VLOOKUP and repeated that same process with pivot tables. He's like, well, just do this pivot table. I'm like, what's a pivot table, Dan? I don't know any of this stuff. So I was confused at the start, right? Like we all are. And that same process repeated itself. In 2010, I started my first job working at a company called BlackRock in New York City. And I sat down the first day at work, and I was looking at a terminal and a SQL browser, a database browser. And I was just like, what is this stuff? What am I doing here? I thought I was working in finance. This isn't finance. Finance is in spreadsheets. Well, no, it turns out it's in databases and data pipelines, and we don't rely on spreadsheets for critical financial data. So all that is to say is the way that I have learned is to be as confused as possible, as often as possible. And that's still, kind of a maxim that I live by, is that if I'm not confused and if I'm not, kind of uncomfortable with the work that I'm doing, I realize that I'm probably in the wrong place because I'm not learning anything. So I'm sure that, I'm sure all of us have been in that position, right? We really learn and grow when we're most confused and don't really know what we're doing. So let's dive into a few examples, and Mariah, let's can get into the demo now. I really want to show you guys a few examples of how this Sheets to BigQuery growth process has played out. Mariah, do we have my computer screen up now?
Not the right screen. It's like your notes still.
There we go. Cool. Okay, thanks guys for your patience. So this template, this content audit automation template, if you can see my screen, this was, I think, the first Google Sheets template that I ever published. And this was a collaboration. Mariah, it looks like we might be back in my notes. Here we go. Looks good. So this is sorry about that, everyone. This is a collaboration between myself and my business partner now, Ryan Stewart, over at the Webris agency, which is an SEO agency. And let me zoom in on this a little bit so you can see a bit better. And this is super rough, right? Like this is probably the roughest Google Sheets template. If you're familiar with Coding is for Losers, this is like as rough as it gets in terms of some instructions. It's very lengthy. And this sheet is very basic. It executes a basic SEO content audit where you want to pull together Google Analytics traffic, conversion rates, bounce rates, and then external links, right, from Ahrefs this pulls in from. And the entire goal of this sheet is to map out what's the next step for for every page on your site, right? It's a pretty classic SEO challenge. Which pages do you want to trim? Which pages do you want to quality review, delete, or 301 redirect? So Ron and I worked together on this sheet, and I didn't really think anything of it, right? We just put it together for his own team to use. It's very simple. There's only, let me count the formulas in here. I think there's 3 formulas, and they're all VLOOKUPs. So we had a count if here, we have a VLOOKUP, and we have an if. So, I mean, really, really basic formulas, right? Not a lot happening here. But if you ever heard Quincy Jones or anyone talks about music who says every piece of music that was ever made was made with the same 12 notes, I think the same thing is true of spreadsheet formulas. You may not think, because you're a Sheets expert watching this, that using ifs or VLOOKUPs or some of these simpler formulas are impactful to people. But I can guarantee you that they are impactful, because when we publish this template, I think to date like 20 or 30,000 people have downloaded this template. And that's, for a Google Sheets template, in terms of numbers, that's pretty high. That's still higher than I think most of the templates that we've ever published at Coding is for Losers. So that opened my eyes. This was back in 2017. Opened my eyes to, you can do some pretty simple stuff with Sheets, but that is impactful on people's lives and their work. So this just grew over time, right? We got, a ton of requests for features. Ryan's team had a bunch of features they wanted to add to it, a bunch of extra data that we wanted to port in. So eventually, over time, it evolved into this sheet that I'm popping up now, which is called the Website Quality Audit. This just pulls in extra data. It pulls in keywords from SEMrush or Ahrefs, pulls in a site crawl from Screaming Frog, and some performance data from Google Search Console, just some additional data fields. And over time, it just really began to bloat, right? And now this is pulled up just on a lag there. The sheet just began to bloat, and it became too big really to handle in a Google Sheet. It would work fine on pages, on sites under like 10,000 pages, but really, it would start to slow to a crawl because all the formulas, all these VLOOKUP formulas, right, were running in the back end, and the sheet would always be running. There would always be a progress bar here. So the way we got around that, and this, by the way, this all is extremely typical of the kind of growth path in Google Sheets, going from Google Sheets to a more complex Google Sheet, right? A simple Google Sheet, more complex Google Sheet. And then at some point, we just kind of hit the ceiling of what we could handle in a sheet, and we realized, okay, we need to start building some custom functions that we can run, one time, snapshot them, and just have them run, right? Not have them always refreshing anytime someone opens the sheet or modifies data. So what we did is, and AppScript will pull up in a moment here, but what we ended up doing is writing our own version of VLOOKUP. So it'll pull up in a second here. I ended up writing our own version of VLOOKUP, which runs in the background, snapshots, and basically extended the life of this sheet, right? So we could kind of squeeze more juice, more performance juice out of the sheet. But ultimately, at some point, we just reached the end of the spreadsheet. It just became more than a sheet could handle. And people started asking us to do, 50,000 page sites, 100,000 page sites, stuff like that. And it just became like, well, how are we going to service this? How are we going to do this? And it became clear that really you just have to move to BigQuery, right? Or some database. We're going to have to do this in a database. We weren't going to be able to scale any further out of Sheets using AppScript or anything else. So what we basically evolved is a process where we port all the data. Instead of using Sheets as our data warehouse, we ported all the data into BigQuery so that we had all the data in the database. We, instead of running spreadsheet functions, we wrote SQL queries, like so. This will be on a lag, but wrote a bunch of SQL to automate the formulas that we were running in the sheet. And we use an open source framework called DBT, which is getdbt.com, that I super highly recommend for anyone who's looking to work in databases in this way. So we ported all the functions into SQL queries basically, but we still use the Google Sheet for our reporting and actual as a workbook. So nothing really changed in the setup except for our data warehouse and how we're processing data in SQL rather than functions. So that's the main thing I want to impart about BigQuery is the tools have gotten so I'd say inexpensive and widely accessible to get data into BigQuery and there's so many resources out there for learning SQL that the cost to startup time to getting a data pipeline going in BigQuery is lower than ever. And then what that allowed us to do is ultimately we built out data studio reporting off of this BigQuery recipe for the website quality audit. And what people do now is export data from the Data Studio report back to Sheets. So we basically made Data Studio our interface for working with BigQuery so that non-technical folks who are using these recipes, like the website quality audit, right, don't have to know SQL, don't have to go into BigQuery at all. They can just use Data Studio or use Sheets. I really want to impart the ecosystem and how things have changed. Mariah, could you cut back to the wide shot, please? So let's go ahead here. So the whole ecosystem here has evolved so much, as many of you know, over the last few years, to the point where there's now a native connector from Google for Sheets and BigQuery. At Codings for Losers, we published our own connector that allows you to push data up to BigQuery, pull it back down into Sheets. There's a bunch of other Google Sheets add-ons and connectors that allow you to bridge this gap, right? And I'm sure many of you are already using Google Data Studio for reporting. So making the move to BigQuery is not a unilateral kind of like switch and, we just don't use Sheets anymore. No, that's not really the way it works. For us, it's just another tool in the tool belt, an additional scaling option, and you end up using it as your data warehouse. But we still use the rest of the, kind of G Suite, more standard ecosystem as we did before, because most of the folks that we're setting up BigQuery recipes or data pipelines for aren't necessarily technical people. So that's one thing I really want to get across. It's not like about leaving things behind. It's about just adding a tool to your tool belt. And this process that we went through, this kind of turning of the screw, right, to use that image of going from a simple Sheets template to a more complex Sheets template that uses some AppScript to pushing data into BigQuery and using SQL models to analyze your data, that is a process that we've seen play out over time. And in every aspect of our work, that's just kind of the process, right, for developing these data products. And I think I would be surprised if there weren't some folks here watching who haven't just naturally, gone through that exact same process, just like, in a bunch of parts of the world, people learned how to make pasta all around the same time, right? This isn't some massive secret that I'm sharing here. So let's dive into another example. And Mariah, if we could go back to, actually, let's stay on the wide shot for now. This other example, I think, is called the agency data pipeline, for starters. And this is a custom reporting solution that we basically built out for digital agencies. And the common challenge there, and if you've ever worked with, Google Ads or Facebook Ads data or anything like that, if you ever worked with supermetrics, you'll know what I'm talking about. A very common problem is for anyone who's doing marketing online is you're advertising across all these different platforms. How do you get your data together into one place so you can look at all of your line items in one place? How much you spend on Google Ads, how much you spend on Facebook Ads in one table, versus having to open up the two different dashboards and look at them separately. So that problem is obviously, it's a large problem if you are working at a single company and you have one of each account, right? It's annoying. If you're a digital agency and you have 50 clients and you have 200 accounts that you're managing, it's intractable. You just really can't do it in any super organized way, or it's very, very difficult to do it in an organized way and consistent way in spreadsheets. So what we basically confronted this problem as it came to us, right? So we're working with a digital agency in California. We're helping them build these, dashboards in Google Sheets and Data Studio. And at some point realized we had this scaling issue. And how are we going to get around this? So we evolved this process that we call the agency data pipeline. And basically, Mariah, if we can switch back to the screen here. Basically what it is a bridge between Google Sheets and BigQuery. So we made what we call the tracking plan, right? This has all of an agency's data in Sheets, and I think this is probably the best example that we've put together of how do Sheets and BigQuery interact and how you can use one as a bridge to the other. So basically this tracking plan has settings for everything you'd ever want to set up. And this is just a template, so it doesn't have data in it, unfortunately. But this you would fill out with all of your sites and all of the data feeds, right? So if you want, Facebook ads or Google ads data feed, all of your account mappings and conversion goals, and basically all of the indicative data that you would need in here. And then, this sheet is set up. We have a Google App Script connection that's set up that will push data up to BigQuery on a schedule. And we have triggers in the back end that will push this data, these settings, right, from Sheets up to BigQuery. And then toggling to a little SQL model here. So then we'll basically write SQL models that will pull in these settings from Google Sheets. And why this is really important is a non-technical user at a digital agency can go into a sheet, set up some new settings, right? Some new Google Analytics channel mappings or something like that. Set up those settings. Those get ingested into BigQuery. And then in the SQL models, we just ingest those downstream. So for a non-technical user to interface with BigQuery, they can use Sheets, right, as their kind of form, as their data entry vehicle. And then those can automatically be ingested. And in the case of like Google Analytics, this is why I love DBT and why I highly recommend it. DBT allows you to use what's called Jinja syntax or notation. I'm not exactly sure what the technical term for it is, but it's called Jinja. And you can write for loops and if statements and set variables that will generate your SQL models for you. And at Coding for Losers, we've published a bunch of kind of open source data models for common data sources, right? So Facebook ads, Google ads or AdWords, Shopify, stuff like that. There are tons of examples on the Coding is for Losers blog that you can pick up and use. And for me, that's the number one blocker, right? Mariah, can we go back to the slide shot, please? So for me, that's the number one blocker of why not move to BigQuery when you hit this scaling challenge, right? When your sheets start to slow down, when you need something bigger, why not move to BigQuery? For me, it's mainly because of SQL and the fact that you have to learn a little bit of SQL or become competent in SQL to make this move. But I have to say that if you can learn the Google Sheets query function, you can learn SQL. So I guarantee that there's a ton of you watching this who are really great in Google Sheets, haven't worked in SQL yet because you haven't had the need to or the opportunity to. But I guarantee if you've written any type of query in Google Sheets, you'll have absolutely no problem mastering SQL. And there's more resources than ever out there for doing that. Ben has a blog post on learning the query function. At Coding is for Losers, we have a course on it. There's tons of blog posts. And the same thing goes for SQL, right? We have a course on it. There's tons of materials out there. So it's never been a better time to kind of add this technical, arrow to your quiver, so as it were. So let's go back to, we've already covered like why not make this move. Let's cover why. Like what in our experience have we gotten from making this move to BigQuery? I think the first thing is just data size, right? Like we cannot handle data at the size that we need to in a Google Sheet. So just the 5 million cell limit, well, it's much better than the 2 million cell limit there was before. There's just some, you reach a data size that you just can't handle in a spreadsheet, and at that point you need a database like BigQuery. The second is speed. So sheets can slow down. They just do. You can partially, it can be our own fault, right? My own fault for writing, inefficient formulas. And I know Ben has a great post on how to speed up formulas in sheets, or how to kind of optimize for speed. But at some point, if you want to run more complex functions, looking at regex and stuff like that, it'll just run faster over a large amount of data if you're in a database like BigQuery. And the last thing is complexity. So, I think things like areas like machine learning and more advanced statistical analysis, they're a little buzzwordy, right? In practice, to be honest, I haven't seen a ton of companies or digital agencies like really implementing them effectively. So I think they're a bit of a ways off, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't keep your options open to try them, right? At least have the flexibility to spin them up quickly if you decide you need to. So having data in BigQuery gives you the flexibility to try these new things, right? To run R scripts, to run Python scripts, to write, user-defined functions in BigQuery SQL. Stuff like that, take advantage of BigQuery's ML, built-in ML capability, right? You can't take advantage of stuff like that until your data is in BigQuery, right? And there's never been more ways to get data into BigQuery, so it's not like, that's not a huge thing to do. So let's get into what do you really need to do to learn this stack? What are the elements that you need to learn to kind of master this like data pipeline, BigQuery construction stack? And this is a graphic that I think I put together for my first course, Data Analysis the Lazy Way, back in 2016. And this cupcake just maps out what is a data analysis process. Every data analysis process, whether you're running it in Google Sheets, BigQuery, whatever it is, everyone has raw data. That's like kind of the meat of the cupcake. That's the cake, right? The foundation. You have to get raw data, get access to raw data, make sure it's clean, right? Next, the frosting is kind of like the glue of the data analysis. That's the wrangling of data. That's the Google Sheets formulas or the SQL or however you're kind of processing that data to get, the metrics that you want to calculate. And lastly, the sprinkles is like a data visualization. So, we do that in Data Studio. You can do that in Looker, Mode, Tableau, Sheets, whatever it is. The sprinkles are the actual answers to questions, right, that your visualizations are providing. So let's talk about how this cupcake is different. We could call it cupcake to cake, right? Sheets to BigQuery. How is it different? Well, at the raw data level, in Sheets, you might be using tools like Supermetrics, or, there used to be BlockSpring, which isn't really around anymore. Or you might be using app scripts, integrations that you've written. There's tons of ways, companies come out with their own connectors, right? There's tons of ways to get data into Sheets, Zapier, stuff like that. In BigQuery, Similarly, there's an entire ecosystem of tools that will get data into BigQuery for you. For one, there's Google's, kind of native transfer service for Google services. We use Stitch. We're big fans of Stitch. It's a little, lower cost than some of the other options. We're about to publish our own tool called query.recipes that executes the recipes for you that I was talking about. Query.recipes if you want to check it out. There's Fivetran. There just couldn't be more access to tools to get raw data wherever you want it to go. In my opinion, at this point today, that's a commodity, right? And there's easy access. Then let's talk about wrangling data, right? So in Sheets, you use formulas. In BigQuery, we use dbt models. And again, there's tons. We've published open source models. The Fishtown Analytics team, which maintains dbt, has done an awesome job at publishing open source models, right, on some of those sources I mentioned, Facebook ads, etc. It's never been easier to get started writing your own SQL models. It's much easier to pull down kind of an open source version and work on it versus having to write everything from scratch. And then at the visualization layer, you don't really need to learn anything new. That's a hot swap. You can just swap out Google Sheets for BigQuery in whatever data visualization tool you're using. And you really get some bonus in terms of performance, right? Because Google Data Studio, for example, they have what they call the BI engine. I don't know if it's a product or a feature, but it will basically cache your data from BigQuery for you so that every time you load a report, you're not, hitting BigQuery with a fresh query and loading everything in. It's much, much faster. So really that is to say, the only piece that I see as challenging, or at least something, a new skill to learn, is really data wrangling, right? And SQL versus Sheets functions. But as I've mentioned, I think that's something that naturally evolves, and there's tons of great resources out there to do that. Let's see. Cool. So I think what I really want to talk about now is how we can help, right? How we can help you make this transition from Sheets to BigQuery. One, as I've mentioned, there's tons of resources out there online for any of these things, right? If you're looking for SQL, if you're looking for, get data from Google Ads to BigQuery, a simple Google search on any of these topics will net you a ton of often free, usually free resources. So one, you can definitely start there. But at Coding is for Losers specifically, other than publishing free tutorials on all of this stuff, we also offer a course that goes through that entire agency data pipeline process and gives you all the templates, all the SQL model repos, everything that you need to build that type of data pipeline for your team. So I think that's a great course for if you're working in that multi-site environment, right? If you're at an agency, anything like that. It can be useful too if you're working at a single company, but you might want to reach out to me because you might not want to pay full price in the course if it's not really the exact thing that you need, right? So just feel free to reach out. The second thing is BigQuery recipes. Like I mentioned, that's live now at query.recipes. That's in beta. There's just an application form up there. What we run there are basically data analysis processes, pre-canned, that you can pull off the shelf and run. So that's stuff like a website quality audit that pulls together, all this SEO data and recommends actions to improve traffic on each page on a site. An ad funnel breakdown pulls together Facebook ads, Google Analytics, etc., and kind of blends them together and visualizes them. So that's kind of your classic. And we also build custom recipes for that, right? So people come to us, we want to port this analysis that we're doing in Sheets into BigQuery. We'll build a recipe and deploy it for you. And then the last way that we work with folks is building custom data pipelines in BigQuery. So again, that's mostly digital agencies, but we do work with some, medium and larger size e-commerce businesses to build those types of data pipelines. And again, that's all at Coding is for Losers /get started. And that will lead you directly if you want to book time with me and just, connect, talk about whatever you're running into. I really enjoy meeting anyone who's working on this stuff. So I'm really curious, what will you kind of dig into your Google Drive folders, after this talk? What will you go back to the drawing board and see, what are you working on in Sheets that might be a good candidate for this move to BigQuery, right? What are you building that is, barely hanging on in Sheets that, that progress bar is running and it's slowing down a little bit, and you want to take the next step with handling data size. So I'm excited to see where things go and where, kind of our Google Sheets community, continues to push things forward in the coming years. So yeah, thanks, Ben, again for having me. You can find some of the stuff I mentioned up at codingisforlosers.com, and my personal Twitter handle is @losershq. So Ben, whenever you're ready, it would be awesome if you could come join us, and hopefully there's a bunch of questions to go through.
David, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you very much for that presentation, David. Really enjoyed seeing the sort of the bones there of the pipeline and how you made that transition from Sheets, your own journey there. I loved some of the quotes we had along the way as well, and some of the analogies there, and the cupcake made a good appearance. I like that.
That's my favorite one. That's old school.
In my mind, the very first day I saw that on your site, I remember years ago.
Yeah.
So we have had a request as to whether you might be able to wear the hat for a few moments.
Man,
or what's underneath the hat.
The underneath the hat is a brand new car. No, it's the reason I wasn't wearing the hat is because I have headphones on.
You have the headphones on, I know, because usually you do. It's your style, so.
Yeah, but I had to have it here, but I'll wear it now.
Yeah, thank you for indulging us for a few moments. So one question that came up actually was, for a small business that's maybe thinking about BigQuery, what are the cost implications potentially for them? What would they need to keep in mind about that too? Because it's a paid service rather than a totally free like Google Sheets.
Yeah. Good question. So for BigQuery itself, storage is very cheap and query is very cheap when you're working at small data size. So I think for most small businesses, they would fall within the free tier of storage.
Yeah, I was about to say
storage and query. You really, the only folks that I work with who actually pay for BigQuery are more on like the enterprise side, or some of these larger agencies will have moderate, couple $100 a month type of BigQuery bills. And the other thing to look out for is your cost of getting data into BigQuery, which can be Stitch, right, has a free tier that a lot of businesses that we work with are on, and after that it's maybe $100, $200 a month for a small and medium-sized business.
Yep. Yeah, and definitely, folks, on that point, as David mentioned, there is a free tier on BigQuery, which is actually pretty generous when you're a small business or when you're learning. So you can certainly make quite a lot of progress and test your ideas out and all that kind of thing totally for free with BigQuery. The only caveat there is just to be careful that you don't accidentally set anything up that's automatically just going to keep running and eventually run up a bill for you. So
well, actually, even on that note, you can do a lot of things without even billing enabled on BigQuery.
Yep,
so you don't necessarily even need a billing account set up. And two, you can set up quotas, right, and auto shut off. So you could set a $5 a month quota and remind you when that's up.
Yep.
Right. So
you just have to remember to set those caps in place before you let your model go loose.
Yep.
But it's great. Okay, so let's see what else we've got here. And then here's a question: is somebody said, what is it about Google Sheets specifically that limits it from handling more data? Sort of what or maybe another way to think about it as well is, how do you know when you're getting to those limits with Google Sheets? Do you have any ideas there?
Yes. Let me just pull up the deck here. That to me is like when you see that progress bar, the kind of scroll bar coming up, that's when you know that you're hitting the limit. The other way that you know that you're hitting the limit is that, they'll actually tell you, you have reached the end of this sheet, right?
Yeah.
So, I think it's one of those things that intuitively. I think you might have put out a little script I say little script because it's one of those like Monday emails you sent out maybe, for counting the number of cells that are in use or something like that in a sheet.
Yeah, so I actually I published a little tool to do that, and actually Tiller as well have an add-on that measures the size of your sheets.
Cool. So
You know,
those
so
are more scientific methods. I'm more of the intuitive approach.
yeah. Well, also it's worth mentioning that you have 5 million cells
Yeah.
as things stand in Google Sheets. Although they will be upping that, doubling that, I think, later this year.
Cool.
But you won't get close really to having 5 million cells of data in Google Sheets, not even close. You'll find, once you get hundreds of thousands of rows of data, it will be kind of slow. It'll get a little bit laggy, and that's when you hit that point, like David said, where you can just notice that lag and it starts to affect your your workflows and things, and it's a bit of a pain. That's the time then to think, okay, actually, even just slightly before that, because you don't want to be running right up against that limit in some sort of mission critical, data set, and then be scrambling to fix it and work out what to do with BigQuery.
Yeah.
If you anticipate that in advance, then you really should be, trying to make that change early.
Exactly. Thank you for emphasizing that, because what I really recommend is like, I think as we're seeing with our current global situation, the more you can prepare for inevitable growth of something, the better situation you'll be in. So if you know that the company you work at, you're growing and your data set is growing, right? You know that you're going to outgrow the sheet at some point. So getting your skills together, being competent in something like BigQuery so that when you need to flip the switch, you can, is just a great, I think just a great kind of like career plan to have in your back pocket.
Yep. I would say that just on that point there, career plans, it's a great point. Spreadsheets, like you mentioned actually with your own journey, you realized very early on that spreadsheets were going to be this differentiator in your own career. And if you learned spreadsheets, it would open up so many more doors.
Mm-hmm.
And I think once you're at that level where you know spreadsheets, the next natural progression is the database. And if you learn databases, you learn a little bit of basic SQL, like David's saying, it just, again, opens up that board game in front of you, both for your own career and for the sorts of solutions you can build at work. So it's a really good next step.
Yeah, and it's, you keep kind of climbing the ladder. So if you go in and learn the query function in Sheets, and then you learn SQL as needed, then, well, you might be able to pick up Python or something like that. It just, when you get over that next, it's kind of like, climbing a mountain. You don't just walk straight up the mountain, right? It's a series of more intermediate hills that you're walking up, and then you look back and you're like, oh wow, I'm top of this like big mountain, but I just walked up a bunch of hills. So
exactly, you have a base camp, and then you make intermediary camps.
Yeah, it's not like you don't have to sit down and eat the whole meal at once. Not to beat up the analogies, but
let's see what else we've got here then. Can SQL? Somebody asked, can SQL handle? Can BigQuery handle things like operations, like doing arithmetic and conditionals? And maybe you can talk a little bit about what you can do in BigQuery with your SQL.
Yes. So the short answer is yes. And if you can think of any type of math that you're doing in a sheet, certainly that you'd want to do, SQL would, and BigQuery SQL specifically, would be able to handle any of that.
Yep. It's like you mentioned with the query function. If you've ever tried that, you can do things like arithmetic on a column, or add things, or filter things, that kind of thing, create new columns. And that's the sort of stuff that you can do, again, with SQL code. It's very similar to that.
Exactly. So it's the key difference, I would say, is like, imagine you have like the ugliest Sheets formula imaginable. You have, a filter, a count wrapped in a filter, wrapped in a query, wrapped in bacon, whatever it is.
With an array formula as well.
Yeah, exactly. With an array formula to pass it around. And SQL statement is basically wrapping all of that business logic up into one single sentence, where you have parameters. You select certain columns with certain math, right? Average, sum, whatever it is. You have a where parameter with specific conditions. You can group it, order it, all that stuff within, from my perspective, it's much easier to read SQL certainly clean, well-written SQL than a lot of spreadsheet formulas that that I've written personally.
Yeah, I agree. I think well, when SQL gets obviously complex, it gets pretty hard. But certainly
Yeah.
when you're learning on those basics SQL statements, I always advocate reading them out as if it was a sentence, because you literally say select these columns from this table and then do this to them where they equal this, or it really should almost read and flow quite nicely.
Yeah, one other thing I want to mention on that. So that's really why we use the DBT open source framework for SQL modeling. And that's because you can write each of your SQL queries as very, very simple queries, where it just select of columns, maybe a grouping from a single table, right? Maybe there's a single join in there. And then you can kind of stack your references, if that makes sense, so that you're always writing a simple query to reference another simple query, and you can kind of trace it through and you can reuse that block in like a bunch of different places versus rewriting these like monster SQL queries. So it's much more readable.
A modular approach. And that's the idea of your recipes of sort of building these up. Yeah, nice. Okay, so someone actually asking just here, so they're not too familiar, never seen SQL maybe, and they're saying, do you think it's a good idea to get familiar with the Sheets query function and spend time there before starting SQL, or whether they could just go straight into SQL sort of simultaneously?
Absolutely. I would start with the Sheets query function. And the reason there is you already have data. Likely, if you're watching this, you already have your data in Sheets. You have some data that you can work with. And so you'll have a lot of context. So I definitely recommend as a first step, just start using queries instead of countifs or, anything like that within your own, sheets that you're using. And then once you're comfortable with the language, with query language, and I have to say, and you have a data size or scale or speed issue, if you don't have any issues in the sheets that you're using, why would you do I'm super lazy. Why would you do any of this? Why would you move to BigQuery if you don't have to? So I wouldn't attack it until you really need it, or you see yourself needing it.
Fair point. And the query function again, I think, folks, it's worth learning as well for its own value in Sheets. It's a really useful formula there. I think probably, I'm not sure you see what you think about this, David, but one of the hurdles with moving up to the SQL database is simply just getting the database set up and getting to that first point when you can actually write a query, and then the actual query is relatively simple. But I think the nice thing with BigQuery is that that's a lot simpler than the traditional database on a server yourself that you'd always have to administer and all that kind of stuff and set up.
One point on that. So BigQuery is not actually a database. So when we think of databases, we think of like an actual database server that you own and you run somewhere, right? And they're somewhat expensive, a couple $100 a month, something like that. BigQuery is not that at all. It's Google stores your data and then you just query it when you want it. You don't have like a dedicated server anywhere. So all you have to do is set up what they call a project, and then you can start loading data into that project through a GUI,
like your add-on.
Yeah, one, you can use our add-on, right, that we published and open source script. There's other add-ons that do that will create your table schema based on some data that you have in Sheets. But also, within just the BigQuery console, you can go in and with a few clicks, auto-create a table from a Google Sheet. That's a live view of a Google Sheet. So that's an easy way to get started. The classic annoyance of setting up your database and setting up your tables being a blockade to starting to work on your data just doesn't exist with BigQuery.
Yeah, exactly. And the other thing you can do, folks, as well, is there are a bunch of public data sets there in BigQuery that are gigantic. Actually, Andy Rudd in his presentation yesterday used that New York City bike data set, 59 million rows, and he was using that in his demonstration for connected sheets. So they're all available there in BigQuery. You can log in, set yourself up, and then just start learning how to write SQL queries with those data sets.
Yeah, and a good one.
so-
Sorry to jump in here, Ben. A
Yeah,
good
no,
one
go for it.
that we have a tutorial on using is the Google Analytics sample data set.
Yep.
So if you're working with marketing data, that's an easy place to start.
Yep, great. That's awesome. David, we'll share your links in the sidebar again and in the resources that we're going to send out next week. Thanks very much for that entertaining presentation. And certainly I learned a lot about the analytics pipeline and have a lot of food for thought there. So thanks very much, David.
Thanks for having me, Ben. Really appreciate it. Had a good time.
Yeah, it's been great. And we'll speak soon.
All right.
Everyone else, we will be going off air briefly and back at 2 p.m. with Andy Conlin, who's been a freelance Google Sheets developer for the past few years. And he is going to give us some insights into his career and how he finds clients and how he manages a small business providing Google Sheets and AppScript solutions for his clients. So stay tuned and we'll see you at 2 o'clock, folks. Thank you. Bye-bye.